coffee was never meant to be armor, but I held it like it was. The latte in my paper cup had gone cold, and the cardboard still warmed my palms the way a lie can. The café in Fells Point, Baltimore, pulsed with mid-afternoon confidence, brick walls, indie music, people ordering names they wanted to be. I took the corner booth because it let me watch without being watched, or at least that was the fantasy. My battered laptop hummed on the table, open to a medical translation job that needed to be done by midnight. Every sentence I finished felt like buying myself one more day. At 29 and 5 months pregnant, my body negotiated with every chair and every breath. The wooden seat pressed into my hips. My lower back carried a constant throb that no stretching fixed. I'd bought maternity jeans from a thrift rack and pretended the pinching waistband was normal. The baby shifted when I leaned forward, a private reminder that my life wasn't just spreadsheets and deadlines anymore. I translated technical terms while my mind did its own math. Rent, groceries, prenatal vitamins, and the quiet fear that one bad week could erase everything I'd rebuilt after my divorce. My phone stayed face down beside the keyboard, but I could feel it vibrating in my imagination. Missed calls from a lawyer I'd stopped answering because every minute cost money I didn't have. Emails from clients asking if I could rush another document, as if I had extra hours hiding in my pockets. I kept telling myself that if I stayed small and worked hard, I could glide through the world without anyone noticing how fragile I was. What I didn't know yet was that the past doesn't care how quietly you type. It will walk right up to your table. I heard my name the way you hear thunder before rain, familiar, inevitable, and already too close. When I looked up, Ethan Cole stood a few feet away, polished like a magazine ad for second chances he didn't deserve. Navy blazer, expensive watch, haircut to signal success. His smile arrived first, then the cold behind it. A woman leaned into him, all glossy hair and confident posture, her hand parked on his arm like a claim. I recognized the posture immediately. I used to stand like that beside him, before I learned that being chosen by him wasn't the same as being safe. I tried to shift out of the booth, but pregnancy makes you slower, and Ethan understood timing the way a bully understands weak spots. He stepped just enough to erase the narrow aisle, not touching me, just turning his body into a door. His eyes traveled over me in a slow inventory. My thrifted sweater, my worn shoes, the curve of my belly that refused to apologize. The woman beside him, Madison, did her own quick scan and dismissed me with the bored mercy of someone who thinks she won. My chest tightened as the cafe noise blurred, because I knew what was coming before it arrived. Ethan didn't just insult me. He performed me. He wrapped his cruelty in fake concern, letting his voice float a little louder than necessary, the way people do when they want strangers to agree with them. He reminded me publicly of the version of myself I used to maintain for him, and he used my changed body like evidence that I'd failed. I could feel the invisible eyes, even when no one stared directly. The espresso machine hissed like it was swallowing my humiliation, and that was when the mini-truth hit. This wasn't an awkward run-in. This was strategy. He wanted me small, and he wanted witnesses to watch me become it. If you've ever been judged in public, you know how your skin turns into a loudspeaker. Heat crawled up my neck, and my hands curled under the table so I wouldn't do something reckless. I kept one palm on my stomach, feeling the baby kick like a tiny protest. At 3:12 in the afternoon, I fixed my eyes on the condensation ring my cup had left on the wood and counted my breaths until they included conceding the room. Till the room stopped tilting. Curiosity about why he was here turned into empathy for myself, then into a steady, settling anger. I wasn't going to beg for space. I wasn't going to vanish to make him comfortable. I inhaled the smell of scorched espresso and cinnamon and told myself I could outlast him. But Ethan shifted again, crowding the booth like he owned my air, and I felt the old reflex in my bones, the urge to apologize for taking up room. What I didn't see coming was the way the entire cafe would change before I even moved. A presence stepped in behind Ethan, close enough that I saw Ethan's shoulders tighten first, like his body sensed danger before his ego did. The music didn't stop. The conversations didn't pause, but the space between tables suddenly felt colder. I turned my head and met a stranger's eyes, dark, calm, and unreadable. He wore a black coat that fit like certainty, and he stood perfectly still, as if the whole room had shifted to accommodate him. Later I would learn his name was Dante Moretti. In that moment, I only understood one thing. For the first time all day, I wasn't alone. Dante was close enough behind Ethan that I could see the shift in Ethan's posture before anything else happened. It was like watching a man trip over his own certainty. 1 second, Ethan owned the aisle beside my booth, using his body like a gate, and the next, His shoulders tightened as if the air had turned heavier. Dante didn't crowd him. He didn't touch him. He simply occupied the space Ethan had been using to make me feel trapped, and somehow that was enough to change the whole equation. I kept my hand on my belly, palm spread over the place that had just become Ethan's favorite weapon. My face was still hot with shame, but underneath it something steadier was building. Anger, quiet and clean. The cafe noise kept going, milk steaming, cups clinking, someone laughing too loud near the pastry case, but it all felt farther away, like the room had stepped back to watch what happened next. I should have slid out of the booth and walked away while I had the chance. So why did I stay? Ethan tried to salvage the moment by dressing it up as concern, as if he had simply stumbled onto me and felt obligated to comment on my life. In the past, that move worked on people. He knew how to sound reasonable while cutting deep, but Dante didn't respond to the performance. He looked at Ethan with a kind of calm that didn't ask for permission, and Ethan's confidence started leaking out in real time. Dante's stillness wasn't passive. It was the kind of stillness that made other people adjust themselves around it. I couldn't hear every word through the rush in my ears, but I understood the shape of it. Dante didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He ended it with quiet certainty, like this wasn't a conversation so much as a decision that had already been made. Ethan blinked, tried to puff up again, and failed. His girlfriend Madison tightened her grip on his arm and tugged him back half a step. And there it was, the real humiliation for Ethan. Not being yelled at, not being threatened, just being dismissed. Ethan still couldn't leave without throwing something over his shoulder. He aimed it at my pregnancy, at the baby, at the idea that my body was public property, and he had the right to comment on it. The jab was sloppy, desperate, meant to sting on his way out. It almost worked. My throat tightened, and for a split second I was right back in the old place where his words decided what I was worth. Then I felt Dante's presence hold steady, like a door closing between me and Ethan's cruelty, and the sting didn't land the way it used to. When Ethan finally stepped away, it happened at a little after 4 in the afternoon, and I knew because the moment felt branded into my memory. The aisle cleared. My lungs remembered how to take a full breath. The cafe returned to itself, but not all the way. People were pretending not to stare, pretending they hadn't heard, pretending they hadn't watched my ex-husband try to shrink me in public. I sat there with my cold cup in my trembling hands and the strange relief of being spared and still exposed. Dante didn't rush in with sympathy. He didn't make a big show of rescuing me. He asked if I was okay in a tone that treated me like a person, not a spectacle. Then he did something small that felt enormous. He asked permission, before taking the seat across from me, like the space belonged to me again. I nodded because my voice felt unreliable. Up close, his face was all controlled edges, dark eyes that missed nothing, stubble that looked like it belonged to late nights, not mirrors. He didn't smile to soften himself. He didn't need to. He flagged down a barista with the kind of subtle signal that usually gets ignored, except it didn't get ignored. Water appeared. A hot drink replaced my cold one without Dante asking me to justify needing it. The care was practical, almost blunt, and that made it harder to dismiss. I wrapped my hands around the warmth and felt my body trying to come back online. Part of me wanted to thank him until my gratitude became a payment. Another part of me wanted to vanish before I owed anything. He introduced himself as Dante Moretti. Just a name. No company, no title, nothing that explained why Ethan had folded so fast. He noticed the shaking I couldn't fully control, and the way my gaze kept flicking toward the door like I expected Ethan to return. Dante's attention didn't feel like judgment. It felt like assessment, the kind that comes before a decision. What kind of man carries calm like a weapon and never has to lift his voice? When he offered to get me home safely, pride rose up out of reflex. I had driven myself here. I had been handling everything alone. I could keep handling it, but my hands betrayed me, trembling around the cup. The thought of Baltimore traffic, of stoplights and sudden breaks and tears that might spill at the worst time, made my stomach roll. I tried to refuse anyway, because refusing felt like control. Dante didn't argue. He simply waited, like he understood that my pride was one more thing I'd learned to use as a shield. That was when the mini-truth surfaced. His help wasn't casual. It was prepared. A man in dark clothing hovered near the front, not watching the pastries, watching the room. Another presence lingered by the windows, angled toward the street. When Dante tilted his head slightly, both men moved at once, coordinated and quiet. Through the glass, I saw a black SUV parked where no one else would dare, idling like it belonged there. A driver stepped out before I even stood up. Rules didn't apply to this man the way they applied to me, and the realization was both comforting and terrifying. I agreed because my body needed it, because my baby deserved a mother who didn't white-knuckle her way home on fear. Dante walked with me, not touching, but close enough that the space around us felt protected. Outside, the harbor air hit my face, salt and diesel and cold wind off the water. My old car keys sat heavy in my pocket, and one of Dante's men took them with an efficiency that suggested this was normal, that my car would be delivered to my building without me having to ask how. The ride to my apartment felt like traveling between worlds. Fells Point's cobblestones blurred behind tinted glass. My reflection floated faintly in the window, tired eyes, flushed cheeks, a belly that made everything undeniable. Dante sat beside me, silent in a way that didn't demand conversation, and that quiet let my thoughts get loud. I didn't know if I was grateful, or afraid, or both. I only knew that my life had just intersected with someone who moved through the city like gravity. When we reached my modest building, the hallway light flickered like it always did, and the contrast made my chest ache. Dante handed me a thick, minimalist card, his name and a number, nothing else. It felt heavier than paper should. At my door, I told myself I wouldn't use it. I told myself this was a one-time collision, a strange mercy, nothing more. Then I stepped inside, closed the door, and realized I was keeping the card anyway. 3 weeks after Fells Point, I told myself the café had been a fluke. I kept translating until my eyes burned, heating cheap soup and pretending it counted as dinner. I stretched every dollar, rewrote my grocery list, and folded baby onesies from a thrift bag like they were proof I could do this alone. Dante Moretti's card stayed hidden in my wallet, creased at the corners from being carried everywhere but never touched. Some nights I'd take it out, feel the heavy stock, then put it back as if the paper could hear my pride, and still, I waited. The routine was calm on the surface and frayed underneath. My back ached more each day, and the baby's movements felt stronger, like he was practicing his own opinion. I avoided that cafe, avoided downtown, avoided any place Ethan might appear with his polished smile. When the mail came, I skimmed it with the same dread I used to reserve for Ethan's moods. I kept telling myself that if I stayed invisible, the past would get bored and move on. Have you ever tried to outrun someone who can reach you without leaving his house and make you feel cornered? Then the envelope showed up like a dare. It was propped against my apartment door, too thick, too clean, the kind of paper that doesn't belong in a hallway that smells like old carpet. My name was printed with expensive confidence. I didn't need to open it to know it meant trouble, but my hands did it anyway, because fear always wants details. The pages inside were dense and formal, the language sharp enough to cut without raising a voice. It smelled faintly of cologne and money, and my stomach dropped as if it recognized Ethan before my mind did. He was contesting the divorce. He claimed I had hidden my pregnancy during the proceedings, twisting time and biology like they were flexible. He demanded a DNA test at a clinic he would choose, custody rights for a baby he had never cared to protect, and access to my financial records as if my poverty was evidence of guilt. A court date was scheduled, and a response was required within 14 days. Every paragraph threatened consequences if I didn't comply, consequences spelled out in verbs that made my pulse race. How do you fight a rich bully with paper alone? I made it to the bathroom before the nausea hit. Not the gentle morning sickness I'd learned to manage, but panic, hot and sour, rising fast. I knelt on the tile, breathing through waves, one hand braced on the sink, the other pressed to my belly. The baby kicked, stubborn and alive, and that little movement yanked me back from the spiral. I rinsed my mouth, stared at my own face, and felt anger settle behind my ribs. Ethan wasn't trying to be a father. He was trying to own me again, using the law as a leash from afar. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter spread out beside my laptop, translating nothing now, just rereading my own fear. I could call my attorney, but I could already hear the meter running in my head. I could ignore it, but ignoring deadlines is how you lose your rights before you know you're in a fight. Ethan understood that. He was betting on my exhaustion. The only other option was the card in my wallet, the name that felt too sharp to speak in my apartment. Calling Dante felt like admitting I couldn't survive without a stranger. Night stretched thin. I tried to work, but every medical term blurred into the thread of custody papers and courtrooms. I walked the apartment, checked the locks, checked my phone, checked my belly like the baby could give advice. Around midnight, I pulled Dante's card out and held it under the light. The number looked unreal, like a door I wasn't allowed to open. My hands shook as I dialed, and when the call connected, my words spilled out in a rush I couldn't control. Dante's voice came through clear and awake, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. I expected annoyance or distance, the polite tone that says you've asked for too much. Instead, steadiness filled the line, like someone reminding me to breathe. Dante asked where I was, and it sounded like logistics, not curiosity. When I told him, he didn't suggest another number or offer advice from afar. He said he was coming, immediately. No hesitation, no bargaining, no conditions. Relief hit so hard I had to sit. Then fear followed, because letting him in meant admitting how easily Ethan could still reach me. I stared at the letter and realized survival sometimes means accepting help. The minutes after the call moved, slow then fast at once. I cleaned nothing, but I straightened everything, like order could protect me. I set the envelope on the table, moved it, set it back, unable to stop touching the threat. I listened to the hallway outside my door, muffled footsteps and TVs, and wondered what kind of man shows up after midnight because a stranger is scared. At 12:24 after midnight, the knock came. Not loud, not frantic, certain. My heart split into before and after, and I knew the next breath would change my life. The knock hadn't faded from the air when I unlocked the deadbolt. Dante Moretti stood in my hallway like he belonged there, not because the building was impressive, but because he carried his own atmosphere. My apartment smelled like instant noodles and printer ink, and the living room was half nursery, half workstation. I hated how small it looked with him inside it. He didn't step forward until I shifted back, giving him space, and even then he moved with a quiet caution that made my pulse slow. My fear didn't vanish, but it stopped running for the first time. I set the envelope on the table and slid the pages toward him as if they were contaminated. Dante read without sitting at first, eyes moving line by line, his face giving away almost nothing. The only change was in his stillness. It tightened, became sharper, like a blade being honed. I watched his fingers hold the paper with precision, and I realized he'd seen intimidation dressed up as procedure before. When he reached the demands about custody and testing, my stomach clenched again, but his focus didn't waver. It made the threat feel smaller, even while my hands shook. My instinct was to refuse whatever he planned, because I couldn't afford charity and I couldn't afford to owe him. Ethan had spent years teaching me that help always came with a price, even when it looked like love. I told myself I could find a legal clinic, borrow money, sell my car, anything except become dependent on a man whose power I couldn't measure. But the letter's deadline sat in my throat like a chokehold. Have you ever been threatened by paperwork? The kind that looks polite while it ruins you? I could feel myself slipping toward panic again. Dante let me finish my spiral, then grounded it the way you'd steady a table with one firm hand. He made it clear, in that low, even tone, that he wasn't offering pity. At 12:47 after midnight, I remember staring at the clock on my microwave and understanding he was building a structure around me. Steps, boundaries, solutions. He had attorneys who could answer this letter with force Ethan couldn't buy off, and he wanted me to stop apologizing for needing protection. The word exchange kept surfacing in my mind, as if it was how my dignity breathed. Then he explained what he wanted from me, and it wasn't my gratitude. He needed a translator he could trust for legitimate port and logistics contracts arriving in multiple languages, the kind of work I'd been doing for pennies in cafes. He described import and export, shipping schedules, compliance forms, the boring paper backbone of commerce. He offered real pay and stability that would let me buy baby essentials without counting coins. In return, his legal team would dismantle Ethan's harassment attempt before it became a courtroom nightmare. Could an exchange still change my life? My chest tightened with possibility. I didn't pretend it sounded normal. I asked myself what kind of shipping operation required many languages, and why a man like Dante didn't just hire a firm downtown. The power imbalance sat between us like a third person. I made rules in my head and said them plainly. My work would be clean, my role limited, my body and my baby off limits to office gossip. Dante accepted those boundaries without irritation, and that mattered. He didn't act like he was buying me. He acted like he was hiring me. Still, I wondered what he wasn't saying behind that calm. His explanation came softly, reluctantly, and it was the first time his control showed a seam. He'd watched a woman in his family raise a child alone, terrified and under-resourced, while the world acted like fear was her fault. He remembered being young and powerless then, and he'd promised himself that if he had the ability to step in, he would. Hearing that didn't erase my caution, but it steadied my shame. He wasn't rescuing me because I was weak. He was responding to a pattern he refused to ignore. I felt tears rise and refused to let them fall. I stared at the letter and pictured Ethan smiling behind his lawyer's stationery, certain I'd collapse. Instead, I felt something new. A thin slice of agency. I agreed to meet Dante's attorney in the morning, review the contracts, and decide if I could do the work. He laid out what to bring like a checklist. The envelope, my divorce papers, proof of dates. He said his sister, Elena Moretti, would handle the response. When he stood to leave, he didn't linger. He reminded me I could call if anything shifted overnight, and then he was gone. Everything felt different now. After he left, my apartment went quiet in a way that made every sound feel important. I sat with the envelope and Dante's card on the table, 2 pieces of paper that could steer my future. Relief came, then caution, because hope can be risky. I slept in scraps. Morning arrived fast, and I chose the one outfit that still looked professional, even over my belly. I practiced standing tall, then packed the envelope, my papers, and my laptop. I tucked the card into my wallet and walked outside, heading toward Dante's office and the sister I hadn't met yet. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and tried to make my one professional outfit behave like it still belonged to me. The waistband didn't agree with my belly, the blouse pulled in places it never used to, and the whole thing felt like a costume I'd borrowed from the woman I was before Ethan. I smoothed my hair anyway, packed my laptop, and slid the envelope into my bag like it might leak poison through the zipper. The ride into the inner harbor felt too bright for how little I'd slept. I kept thinking about the knock, about Dante stepping into my apartment without making me feel smaller in it. I kept thinking about the word exchange and the way it had steadied my pride. And I kept thinking about Ethan's letter, because fear is loyal that way. It follows you even when you're trying to walk forward. Dante's building rose out of the city like a promise made of glass and stone. The lobby smelled like polished wood and someone else's confidence. People moved with purpose, dressed in clean lines and expensive shoes that didn't scuff. I felt every scrape of my worn bag strap against my shoulder, every little reminder that I didn't match the room. At a little after 9 in the morning, I stepped through the revolving door and tried not to flinch at my own reflection in the glass. Have you ever realized the bully only wins because you're alone? The thought hit me hard, because this was me showing up to not be alone anymore. A receptionist guided me upstairs, and the elevator's quiet hum felt like a countdown. When the doors opened, everything looked even more controlled. Hallways that swallowed sound, offices with clean desks, people who didn't glance twice at a pregnant woman walking carefully like her balance had changed overnight. Elena Moretti met me before I could get lost. She wasn't warm, not at first. She was precise. Dark suit, hair pulled back, eyes that took inventory the way my old translation clients used to take inventory of deadlines. I felt judged in a way that wasn't cruel, just thorough, like she was deciding whether I was a risk or a responsibility. She led me into her office, and I noticed the view before anything else, water and boats and the city laid out like a map. It made my apartment feel 1,000 miles away. Elena gestured for me to sit, and I handed her the envelope. The way she handled it told me she'd seen these tactics 100 times. My hands wanted to shake, but I held them together in my lap and focused on breathing like I'd been taught. She walked me through the situation with questions that felt like a scalpel. Not prying, not gossiping, just extracting facts. I heard myself summarize my divorce, the months of rebuilding, the timing of my pregnancy, the way Ethan had reappeared like a ghost with a credit card. I kept it tight, because shame makes you ramble, and I refused to give Ethan that much space in my mouth. Then Elena dismantled him. She explained, in plain language that landed like medicine, that Ethan had no legal standing to claim my baby as his. The divorce timeline didn't support his story, and the legal system didn't reward tantrums disguised as concern. What he had sent wasn't a real bid for fatherhood, it was intimidation, designed to make me panic, to make me miss deadlines, to make me agree to something just to stop the pressure. She laid out the plan like she was stacking bricks into a wall. Respond fast, respond clean, respond with proof. Documentation that established conception timing, a formal demand that he cease contact, a clear warning that continued harassment would trigger a countersuit. She didn't promise a fairy tale. She promised strategy. The mini twist wasn't just reassurance, it was the way she flipped the entire power dynamic. Ethan's money wasn't a shield if he kept pushing. If he wanted to drag me into court, she would drag him into consequences. The thought made my chest loosen. Satisfaction edged into my fear, sharp and unfamiliar. What if the help you accept changes who you're allowed to be? Sitting across from Elena, I felt my spine straighten, as if my body finally remembered it could take up space. Once the legal pieces were set, Elena pivoted without softness, like stability was built on practical steps. She pulled out the work agreement, translation contract, confidentiality, deadlines. The expectations were clear enough to breathe inside. Specific languages, specific document types, a schedule that respected the fact I was pregnant and human. The pay rate she outlined made my stomach drop. Not with nausea this time, but with shock. It was real money. Enough to stop counting pennies. Enough to buy a car seat without calculating what bill I'd skip. Still, suspicion is another kind of survival. In my head, I asked the question I didn't want to ask out loud. I needed to know if I was stepping into something dirty and calling it opportunity because I was desperate. Elena didn't pretend ignorance. She gave me a careful, honest answer. What I would touch was legitimate port and logistics work, above board, the kind of paperwork that keeps ships moving and businesses compliant. She didn't speak for every corner of Dante's world, but she drew a clear boundary around mine. That mattered. I could work inside that line. Before I signed, Elena gave me one more piece of truth that felt like both validation and warning. Dante didn't involve himself like this often. He didn't pull strangers into his orbit unless something about them stuck. She didn't say it like a compliment. She said it like a fact that should make me pay attention. My throat tightened with a new kind of fear. Why me? And what did it mean that I'd made an impression on a man like him? I signed anyway, because I wasn't signing away my autonomy. I was choosing stability. I was choosing to keep my baby safe with more than hope and stubbornness. When I left Elena's office, the city looked the same through the glass, but I felt lighter, like someone had finally taken Ethan's hand off the back of my neck. In the elevator down, I held the contract folder and the legal plan in the same grip, 2 forms of protection. My phone buzzed with the first email about document batches, and my heart tripped. My life was moving faster than my mind could process. But for the first time in a long time, fast didn't feel like falling. It felt like forward. 2 months after I signed Dante's contract, my life started to feel like it had corners again. Not perfect corners, not safe corners, but places where my mind could rest for a breath. I rode the bus to the Inner Harbor office 3 days a week, hand on my belly, planning every step the way late pregnancy demands. I learned which seats were easiest to slide into, which stops had the gentlest curbs, and which mornings my back would argue with me the loudest. The security guard in the lobby started greeting me by name, and that small recognition did something bigger than it should have. It told me I belonged here enough to be expected. At the front desk, Marcy kept a jar of ginger candies, and she never made a fuss when she slid one toward me like a secret. Some days I needed it. Some days I just needed the fact that someone noticed. My desk was a modest corner of a shared office, but it felt like a refuge because nobody treated my body like public property. No one stared. No one offered jokes. No one asked if I was sure I should be working. They handed me documents, asked for timelines, and trusted me to deliver. At first, the port language was a maze of acronyms, container codes, and formal phrases that sounded harmless until you translated them wrong. By the end of the first month, I could hear the rhythm in it, like music with strict rules. That competence turned into money, and money turned into sleep. For the first time since the divorce, I set aside a little each week for the baby instead of praying my card would not decline. What do you do when kindness starts to feel like home? Dante was not around constantly, which somehow made his presence more real when it happened. He would appear in my doorway with a paper bag of food, set it down like a normal part of business, and glance at my screen like he respected the work. I could tell he did not bring lunch to perform goodness for an audience. He brought it because he noticed patterns, and my pattern was skipping meals when I got anxious. The first time I thanked him too much, I felt his patience tighten, like gratitude was a debt he refused to collect. After that, I learned to accept care the way I accepted a chair being held steady for me, quietly, without apology. He also learned my silences, and he did not try to fill them with jokes or speeches. We could sit with the hum of printers and distant phones, and I would feel my shoulders lower on their own. Have you ever gotten used to peace, and then felt your body warn you it will not last? Elena's shift from attorney to almost family happened on an ordinary afternoon when she asked if I wanted coffee, not as a client, but as someone who was now in their orbit. In Dante's office, with water glittering beyond the windows, she studied me the way a protective sister studies a stranger near the front door. Her questions landed without cruelty, but they forced me to look at myself from the outside. The pregnant employee, the sudden constant, the woman Dante kept checking on. I could feel the old accusation trying to crawl up my throat, that I must be using someone because I needed help. But I named my boundary in my own head and let it stand there. I worked, I earned, and I refused to be ashamed of surviving. Elena did not soften immediately, yet I saw something in her eyes ease, like she had been waiting for me to say that. Later, when Dante returned and sensed the tension, He positioned himself beside me without touching, and his quiet support felt like a shield. He made it clear, through the calm way he held the room, that I did not owe explanations to anyone. That was when I understood he cared more than he admitted, and the realization scared me almost as much as it warmed me. As if my body wanted to underline the moment, the baby rolled hard against my ribs, a sudden thump that stole my breath. Dante's gaze dropped to my belly, then lifted to my face, and he asked permission with his eyes before he moved at all. When I nodded, his hand rested there for only a moment, warm through fabric, gentle like he was holding something sacred, not claiming it. I had been touched without consent so many times lately that this simple respect felt shockingly intimate. I tried to return to my documents afterward, but my focus kept drifting to the idea that safety could be quiet. Then, without warning, a tightening seized low in my abdomen, different from the usual stretching and shifting. I froze, palm pressing the desk, waiting for it to pass, telling myself it was nothing. It eased, but it left behind a thin thread of dread, and I opened my laptop clock with shaking fingers. At 10:06 in the morning, I realized I was counting seconds like I had watched in breathing videos, and my body was not joking. Dante was in a meeting, and I hesitated, then accepted I might have to call him. The next tightening came before I could even pretend I was fine. I had just reopened a Portuguese cargo declaration, my fingers hovering over the keys like I could type my way out of whatever my body was trying to say. The pressure rolled low and steady, not sharp exactly, but unmistakably organized. It rose, held, then eased in a way that felt planned. For a few seconds I sat perfectly still, listening to the office like it could give me an answer. Printers, footsteps, someone laughing down the hall, normal life moving around my fear. I told myself it was just pregnancy discomfort. I told myself I'd been sitting too long. I told myself the baby was shifting. I told myself anything that didn't force me to admit the truth. Then it happened again. Stronger, closer. Enough that my breath caught and my eyes watered without permission. I gripped the edge of my desk and tried to keep my face neutral. Because old habits die hard, my body had become a public thing for months. I hated the idea of anyone seeing me lose control of it. Have you ever realized your body can rewrite your plans in seconds? I stood up slowly, like movement could reset me. The room tilted just a little. Not fainting, not dramatic, just that subtle warning that something bigger was coming and I should stop arguing. I paced to the window, pressed my palm against the glass, and stared out at the harbor. Boats cut clean lines through the water. People walked like they had all the time in the world. Another wave hit. I bent forward without thinking, one hand braced on the sill, the other sliding to my belly as if I could physically negotiate with my uterus. My baby kicked once, then went still, as if he was listening too. That was the moment denial stopped being an emotion and turned into a risk. Dante was in a meeting. I knew that because I had watched him disappear into the conference room earlier with the kind of focus that meant serious money and serious decisions. I also knew he would hate being interrupted, not because he was cruel, but because he carried responsibility like it was stitched into his skin. My pride tried to make a final stand. I told myself I could wait. I told myself I could ride it out. I told myself I could be the kind of woman who handled things alone. But my son didn't care about my pride. I checked my screen, then my phone, then the small clock on my laptop like time might have changed behind my back. At 10:38 in the morning, I understood what was happening with a clarity that went cold all the way through me. 36 weeks. Too early. Not impossible, but not ideal. And the pattern was tightening, the spaces between shrinking like someone was closing a door. What does it mean when the person you call as a last resort shows up like you were always his priority? My hand shook as I reached for my phone. For half a second, guilt burned in my throat. I pictured Dante at the head of a table, calm and controlled, and I pictured myself crashing into that order with my fear and my inconvenient reality. Then another contraction took that decision away, and I stopped being polite about my own survival. I didn't speak into the phone the way people do in movies. There was no perfect sentence. It was more like my truth fell out in fragments, how long it had been happening, how close the waves felt, how I was trying not to panic, and how I suddenly couldn't pretend it was just discomfort anymore. Dante's response came fast, not loud. The line didn't fill with questions or doubt. It filled with action. I felt it in the way my breathing slowed, in the way my shoulders stopped climbing toward my ears. He made it clear, without needing big words, that I was not overreacting and I was not alone. He told me to stay where I was, and I believed him the way you believe gravity. When he appeared, it was like time bent around him. 1 minute I was staring at the door, counting seconds, and the next he was there, jacket still on, hair still perfectly in place, but his eyes sharper than I had ever seen. Not panic, not fear, something more dangerous than that. Controlled urgency. He didn't waste energy making me feel better with promises. He made me safer with decisions. A driver was already coming around. A route was already chosen. A hospital near enough to reach quickly was already notified. I didn't ask how he could move the world that way. I just held on to the fact that he did. The ride was a blur of harbor streets and sudden bumps that made my body tense. I focused on breathing the way I'd practiced at home, the way strangers on the internet had taught me. And I hated that I was grateful for every silly tutorial I'd ever watched in secret. Dante stayed close without crowding me. I noticed the smallest things. How he kept his hand near mine without grabbing. How he watched my face for cues. How he tracked time without making it my burden. When another wave hit, he anchored me with his presence, steady as a wall. It didn't make the pain disappear. It made it survivable. The hospital lights were bright enough to feel like accusation. Everything smelled clean and sharp. People asked questions that seemed impossibly normal in a moment that didn't feel normal at all. Name, due date, symptoms, timing. I answered when I could. When I couldn't, Dante did. Not as if he owned my story, but as if he was protecting it from chaos. Monitors strapped around my belly turned my baby into lines and numbers. Every beep felt like a verdict. I listened for the tone in the nurses' voices, for the subtle difference between concern and calm. I caught phrases that landed like stepping stones. Early labor, manageable, not ideal, close monitoring, likely fine with support. I clung to manageable like it was a rope. Labor doesn't happen politely. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It takes over the body like a tide and dares you to argue. I stopped trying to be brave in the way I used to define it, quiet, invisible, not needing anything. I became brave in the only way that mattered, staying present. Hours folded into each other. Pain rose and fell. My mind narrowed to breath and pressure and the stubborn thought that my son was coming whether I felt prepared or not. Dante stayed. He stayed through the questions, the checks, the moments I shook with fear and the moments I went eerily calm. He stayed even when the room got crowded and I felt exposed. He didn't treat it like a transaction. He didn't act like he was earning something. He acted like this was exactly where he was supposed to be. And then Noah Bennett arrived. I didn't see a heroic scene. I felt a release, a sudden emptiness that made room for everything else. I heard my baby's cry stronger than I expected. Angry like he had opinions about this whole situation, and I dissolved into exhausted relief so intense it felt like laughter and sobbing at the same time. They placed him against me, warm and real and impossibly small. His dark hair was damp. His fists curled tight like he was holding on to life with both hands. I touched his cheek with one trembling finger and felt love hit me like a wave I couldn't brace for. Noah. My Noah. When I looked up, Dante was standing a few feet away, and his face had changed. The hard lines of control softened into something raw and careful, like he was witnessing a holy thing and didn't want to break it by breathing wrong. Later, when a nurse guided him through the simple mechanics of holding a newborn, Dante's arms wrapped around Noah with reverence. His hands, the same hands that signed contracts and moved meetings and controlled rooms, cradled my son like he was the most fragile truth in the world. In that moment, I understood something that unsettled me more than fear ever had. Dante's gentleness was real, and it ran deep. When the room finally emptied and the adrenaline drained away, quiet settled over us like a blanket. Noah slept in his bassinet, tiny chest rising and falling. My body felt wrecked and holy at the same time. Dante pulled a chair close, sat down heavily, and the air around him shifted. He didn't look like a man about to leave. He looked like a man about to say something that would change the shape of my life again. Hospital rooms make time feel like cotton, soft, thick, hard to push through. After Noah Bennett arrived, the noise drained out of the world. The hush felt unreal, like the air itself was trying not to wake him. I was exhausted, the kind that turns thoughts into slow water. Noah slept in his bassinet, his tiny mouth twitching like he was practicing for a life he'd already decided to fight for. I stared at him until my eyes burned, just to prove he was really here. Dante Moretti sat close enough that I could feel the heat of his presence when I shifted. He looked like a man holding something heavy behind his ribs, waiting for the right second to set it down. His eyes kept drifting from Noah to me, like he was measuring whether I could carry whatever truth he'd carried for months. I realized, with a jolt of fear and hope, that he wasn't here just because he could help. He was here because he wanted to stay. What came from him wasn't a speech. It was a steady, careful admission that he'd fallen in love with me in the quiet places, The paperwork days, the tired mornings, the moments I thought no one noticed. He made it clear that Noah wasn't an obligation or a problem to solve. He wanted to be Noah's father in every way that mattered, not by blood, but by choice. My first reaction wasn't romance. It was disbelief. It was the old reflex that I was too much, too pregnant, too broke, too complicated, too attached to a past I didn't want. Ethan Cole's shadow still lived in the corners of my nervous system. Part of me expected any good thing to come with a trap, so I pushed back in the only way I knew, with practical doubts. I told myself love didn't erase court threats, and a powerful man could wake up one day and regret attaching himself to my mess. I told myself Noah deserved certainty, not a promise made under hospital lights. Have you ever been loved so steadily you didn't know how to hold it? Dante didn't meet my fear with arguments or pity. He met it with choice, the kind of choice that doesn't demand anything back. He let me feel the full weight of my hesitation without punishing it. He made it clear, in the way he stayed seated and still, that he could wait, that he would keep showing up, that he wanted this deliberately, even if I needed time to believe it. What scared me most wasn't his power, but his patience. I told him I could not build anything on half-truths. If he wanted to step into my life, into Noah's life, then I needed honesty about anything that could endanger us. No secret edges, no hidden storms. I needed to know what world I was agreeing to stand in. His answer wasn't defensive. It landed like a vow, quiet, serious, real. In that steadiness, my chest loosened for the first time in months. My yes wasn't loud. It was tired and tender, shaped by survival. It was me letting my hand rest near his and not pulling away. It was me accepting that family could be chosen, and that being chosen could be a form of safety. The next 3 months rewrote my definition of normal. Dante learned night feedings with stubborn patience. He changed diapers with the same focused calm he brought to contracts. In the dim hours before dawn, he hummed soft Italian lullabies under his breath. Not for performance, but because it soothed Noah, and, embarrassingly, it soothed me too. His things appeared in my apartment slowly. An extra toothbrush, a folded sweater on the back of a chair, a mug that didn't match my cheap set. The line between help and home blurred until I couldn't remember where it started. Elena Moretti shifted too. She stayed sharp, always alert, but her warmth stopped feeling conditional. She showed up with freezer meals and practical advice, held Noah like she'd been waiting to love him, and looked at me with something that felt like reluctant respect turning into family. And still, under the softness, I sensed the outline of Dante's world security that arrived before I asked. Doors that opened before I reached them, people who watched the street a second longer than necessary. On a bright day, I took Noah out in his stroller, craving sunlight and pretending we were just like everyone else. At 2:11 in the afternoon, a car rolled into the parking lot too fast and stopped too close, angling in a way that blocked my path back to the sidewalk. 2 men stepped out with the wrong kind of confidence. Not loud, not sloppy organized. Their eyes went to Noah first, then to me, like they were confirming a detail. My body went cold. I tightened my grip on the stroller handle, trying not to show panic, trying not to turn my baby into a target. And then I saw movement at the edge of my vision security, already closing in, already ready. That was when it hit me. This wasn't random. This was the life I'd been spared from seeing up close. And now it had noticed me back. Somewhere behind them, another door inside Dante's world swung open, and I could already feel it swallowing us whole. The sun was bright enough to make everything look harmless. Noah's stroller wheels clicked over a crack in the sidewalk, and for a second my whole world was just that sound. And his soft breathing, and the ordinary miracle of being outside without feeling hunted. Then the dark sedan rolled in too fast. It didn't glide into a spot like a normal car. It cut the lane and stopped at an angle that didn't make sense unless it was meant to block me. My first thought wasn't even fear. It was confusion, like my brain tried to keep the day intact by pretending this was just a bad driver. 2 men stepped out. They weren't teenagers looking for trouble or strangers lost in the wrong neighborhood. They moved like they had already agreed on the next 5 minutes. Their eyes didn't wander. They landed on Noah first, then on me, like they were checking a photo in their head. My body went cold in one clean sweep. Not panic focus. The kind of focus you only get when your baby is involved. My hands tightened around the stroller handle. Not to fight, not to be brave, just to keep my grip steady so I wouldn't tip him or jolt him. Have you ever realized that fear can turn you silent, not because you're weak, but because your whole system is trying to protect what matters? At 3:47 in the afternoon, it hit me with brutal clarity. This wasn't random. This was about Dante. And because I loved him, it was about me. The men didn't have to touch me to threaten me. Their confidence did it. The way they closed distance without rushing, like they expected compliance. Like they expected me to understand that Noah was leverage before anyone said a word. I remember scanning the parking lot for anything familiar. A mother loading groceries, a couple arguing softly, people living inside their normal lives while mine started cracking open. And then the crack widened. SUVs appeared more than one, moving in with a coordination that made my stomach drop. Doors opened. Men in plain clothes stepped out. Not dramatic, not loud, but decisive. The space around me shifted in seconds, like the air itself got organized. One of the approaching men hesitated, not because he suddenly found a conscience, but because he recognized a losing situation. Another tried to angle away, like pride could save him. No one turned it into a spectacle. No shouting, no chaos, just containment. A quick, controlled closing of distance that kept Noah's stroller steady and kept me from becoming the center of a violent scene. I felt a hand near my elbow, not grabbing, not yanking, just guiding me back, creating a barrier between us and them. My lungs finally remembered to work. I pushed air out slowly, the way I'd learned to do when my anxiety tried to swallow me. The strangest part was what hit me next. This wasn't an emergency response that had to be called in. It felt like a system that was already running. Like the second the sedan turned wrong, someone somewhere had already been watching. Mini twist, delivered like a punch. I hadn't been as alone as I thought. Not once. Not on my normal walks. Not on my grocery runs. Not even when I'd convinced myself I was finally just a woman with a stroller and a life. Comforting and terrifying can be the same thing when you realize someone else has been deciding what safety looks like around you. They moved me fast, but not roughly. Noah stayed with me the whole time. I kept my palm on the stroller canopy like touching fabric could keep reality from slipping. A door opened. I stepped into a quiet vehicle that smelled clean and expensive and nothing like my apartment. The seatbelt clicked with a finality I felt in my teeth. We didn't go to my place. We went to Dante's. Not the office. Not the harbor building. A waterfront home outside Baltimore that looked like calm on purpose. Glass, stone, clean lines, and a view of water that could have been peaceful if my hands weren't still shaking. The perimeter felt guarded in a way I couldn't fully see, like security was built into the silence. Inside, the quiet wasn't comforting at first. It was too controlled, too prepared. Like this house had been designed for emergencies I never wanted to imagine. Noah made a small sound in his stroller, alive. Annoyed. Normal. I clung to that normal like it was a rope. When Dante arrived, I knew something was wrong before I even saw his face. He carried restraint the way other people carried breathing. But that day, there was a fracture in it. A tightness at the edges. A kind of contained fear that scared me more than shouting ever could. He checked Noah first. Not performatively. Instinctively. Like his body needed to confirm Noah was safe before his mind could do anything else. Then he looked at me, and I felt the aftershock of everything I didn't know slam into my chest. My hurt came out sharp inside my thoughts. I hadn't agreed to live like a target. I hadn't agreed to have my baby used as a message. I hadn't even been told that this was possible. What do you do when the person you love is also the reason you're being hunted? The truth finally landed. Not like a confession meant to impress, but like something he should have told me earlier and didn't because he wanted me to have peace. His port business was real. Shipping, logistics, contracts, the legitimate machinery that keeps a city moving. But his influence also sat inside an older network, the kind built from family power and rival organizations and grudges that outlast reason. There were rules in that world, and there were people who broke rules to see what would happen. He didn't give me details that sounded like a movie. He framed it the way a man frames a storm. This is where it comes from, this is what it can do, and this is why it found us. An out-of-town crew with Russian ties, he explained in plain, careful terms, was testing him. Not because I was personally important to them, but because I was his soft spot. Because Noah was a way to measure his response. Because threatening women and children is what cowards do when they want leverage without a fair fight. Hearing it said out loud didn't make it exciting. It made me sick. Then he did something I didn't expect. He gave me a real choice. He could move me and Noah away resources, distance, a new life so far outside his orbit that the threat would lose interest. Or I could stay. And he would tighten security and do the harder thing, negotiate with the other port families and power players to restore civilian protection rules, the kind that draw a hard line around women and children. It wasn't romantic, it was practical. It was him admitting love doesn't erase danger, it just makes the stakes real. I didn't collapse. I didn't melt into gratitude. I felt my spine straighten. I asked what it would take to make Noah safe. Not perfect. Safe enough to breathe. I asked what the plan was, how we would know if it changed, and what he would do differently from now on. And I reminded him of my boundary, the one I'd already put on the table. No secrets. Full honesty. Not the kind that comes after something happens, but the kind that lets me make choices before the world grabs them for me. I didn't ask for combat lessons or anything reckless. I asked to be informed, to build safety habits, to stop living in ignorance and calling it peace. In the end, I chose to stay, not because I didn't fear the shadows, but because running wouldn't erase them, and because Dante didn't treat me like baggage he had to relocate. He treated me like a partner in the most basic sense, someone who deserved the truth and the right to decide. He committed to negotiations, and I could feel the weight of that decision settle over the house like a weather change. Meetings would happen, rules would be tested, promises would be measured by actions, not intentions. As the evening approached, Dante began preparing to step back through those port gates and face the people who thought my baby could be a bargaining chip. I stood in that quiet, guarded home with Noah close, grateful and furious at the same time, and determined not to be blindsided again. Because I understood something now. Even if the families agreed on rules, personal enemies didn't always care. And the night that should have been safe was already waiting. The weeks after that parking lot felt like living inside someone else's calendar. Dante spent long days in meetings I wasn't invited to, and I learned the difference between being guarded and feeling safe. Guards can stand at doors. Safety has to settle inside your ribs. When he came home at night, he carried the weight of negotiations like a coat he couldn't hang up. Not because he was scared of other men, but because he was trying to rebuild something fragile. Rules. The kind of rules that exist so women and children don't become bargaining chips. I didn't pretend it meant perfect peace. I understood it the way you understand a storm warning. A boundary doesn't stop weather. It tells people what happens if they ignore it. And then the boundary held. Word traveled back to us in quiet, practical ways. A certain kind of car stopped circling. A certain kind of stare disappeared. The security team shifted from emergency posture to steady routine. I took Noah on a short walk by the water again, and for the first time in weeks my shoulders unclenched without me forcing it. Have you ever realized the scariest threats aren't always the biggest ones, but the ones that turn ordinary life into a performance of vigilance? That's when Dante asked me to marry him. It didn't come wrapped in fantasy. It came wrapped in reality. I could feel, even before I saw the ring, that he wasn't asking for a romance story. He was offering a legal and emotional decision with consequences. His name would become mine in public. Noah would become his in every way that matters. Protection would increase, and so would scrutiny. I would be seen, officially, as his family. The old version of me wanted to flinch. The café version of me, pregnant, humiliated, trying to stay small, whispered that commitment was another trap. But I wasn't her anymore. I'd learned to demand honesty. I'd learned that dignity isn't refusing help. Dignity is choosing the terms you can live with. And I knew, down to my bones, that Dante wasn't offering to own me. He was offering to stand with me. So I said yes because I chose it, not because I needed saving. The family orbit hit fast after that, like stepping into warm weather after a long winter. Elena didn't squeal or cry the way people do in movies, but her eyes softened in a way that felt like approval stamped in ink. Then the rest of them arrived in a flood. Michael Moretti, broad-shouldered and loud with affection, treated Noah like a tiny king the second he saw him. Grace Moretti, all sharp eyeliner and softer hands than she expected you to notice, showed up with a bag of baby clothes that looked expensive, but chosen with care. Tyler Moretti, younger and constantly moving, kept asking me if I'd eaten, if I was sleeping, if I needed anything, like checking on me was his new job. It was intense, protective, a little overwhelming, and somehow it didn't feel like being judged. It felt like being claimed in the only way that didn't make my skin crawl. As family. The wedding itself stayed small on purpose. Dante's waterfront home, a handful of people, the kind of security you could ignore if you didn't look directly at it. No spectacle, no drama manufactured for photos. Just a quiet line I stepped over, leaving my old name behind like a coat that never fit right. I remember looking down at the ring and thinking about how strange it was that something so simple could mean so much. Not luxury, not status. Proof, a public promise, a legal shield, a soft vow made practical. For a few hours, I let myself believe the night would stay gentle. Then happened 11:18 at night, and the sound that snapped through the house wasn't laughter or music. It was the first wrong noise. A crash that didn't belong to celebration. My whole body reacted before my mind caught up. Noah was asleep, and suddenly sleep felt like the most fragile thing on earth. I didn't run toward the noise. I ran toward my baby. Maternal instinct isn't poetic. It's animal and clean. I scooped Noah up, held him close, and moved into the safest space I knew, the one the security team had pointed out in calm moments without ever making it feel like a prison. My hands shook, but my brain stayed strangely clear. And then I felt it before I could even name it, the personal texture of the threat. Not political, not rival, not a faceless test of Dante's power. Entitlement. The same ugly, hungry energy I'd lived under with Ethan, just wearing a more desperate mask now. He wasn't here because of the port. He was here because he couldn't stand that I'd escaped his control and built a life where his opinions didn't matter. The mini twist landed like bile. The rules Dante fought for could scare syndicates into line, but they couldn't cure one bitter man's obsession. I kept distance. I kept my breathing slow so Noah wouldn't feel panic vibrating through my arms. I didn't give Ethan the emotional reaction he came to steal. I made sure the moment was documented, the way Elena had taught me to treat harassment, as evidence, not as a private nightmare. My phone was in my hand, not as a weapon, but as a witness. Security arrived fast, a coordinated rush that didn't turn into chaos. I heard footsteps, clipped voices behind walls, then the sound of control returning, doors secured, a corridor cleared, someone contained. No gory details, no cinematic fight, just the reality of trained people doing what they were hired to do. When the police took Ethan away, the relief I felt wasn't triumphant. It was heavy, like a chapter closing with a thud instead of a ribbon. After the house went quiet again, I finally let myself shake. Dante found me where I was holding Noah, and I saw guilt in him, sharp and immediate. Not because he'd failed in some macho sense, but because his world had brushed my child's life with danger one more time. But I also saw something else in him. Awe, not at violence, at me. Because I hadn't become the scared woman in the café. I hadn't folded. I hadn't begged. I'd protected our baby with calm choices and a steady spine. I'd turned Ethan's obsession into the final proof that would keep him away. Love doesn't erase risk. It changes what you're willing to build anyway. In the months that followed, life didn't become a fairy tale. It became busy and real. Noah got heavier in my arms, then steadier on his feet. I got better at noticing my fear without obeying it. Dante learned how to function on broken sleep and still show up. Elena stopped feeling like a gatekeeper and started feeling like the sister I never knew I needed. And Ethan? If he appeared again in any way that mattered, it wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork, court dates, consequences. A man shrinking under the weight of evidence and boundaries he couldn't talk his way around. Sometimes I still think about that latte going cold in Fells Point, about the humiliation that was meant to make me small. And I think about how my life split into before and after, not because a powerful man noticed me, but because I finally believed I deserved safety and partnership without surrendering myself. If you've ever had to rebuild your dignity from scratch, tell me what part of that journey hit you hardest. And if Claire's story stayed with you, please like, share, and comment, because stories like this matter most when they're not carried alone. Mornings in Dante's waterfront house don't feel like some glossy magazine spread anymore. They feel lived in. There's a plastic dinosaur under the coffee table. There's a stack of translation pages I clipped together with a chip clip because I couldn't find the fancy binder Elena bought me. There's a tiny sock on the kitchen counter that somehow made it there like it paid rent. Noah is pure toddler chaos now, fast feet, loud opinions, sticky hands, and that fearless curiosity that makes me laugh and panic at the same time. I used to wake up bracing for disaster. Now I wake up bracing for him to climb something he absolutely should not climb. Dante shows up in the smallest ways that matter. Early coffee already poured into my favorite mug because he noticed I drink slower when I'm tired. A quick lullaby habit under his breath while he buckles Noah into a high chair, like a rhythm he learned and never forgot. Meetings shuffled without drama because a pediatrician appointment isn't a request in this house. It's just the plan. Watching him do that still catches me off guard sometimes, how protection can look like practical love instead of control. I still remember the cafe booth version of me, the old laptop, the cold latte I couldn't afford to replace, the way I tried to make my body smaller even though I was already carrying a whole life. Shame used to sit on my shoulders like it belonged there. Now, when I think about her, I don't feel embarrassment. I feel tenderness, like she did the best she could with what she had. Then my phone buzzed with a local news alert, and the words on the screen dragged a shadow across my kitchen. Ethan Cole released early. I waited for fear to slam into me the way it used to. I waited for my pulse to spike, for my hands to go cold, for that old instinct to start rearranging my whole day around hiding. Have you ever waited for fear and realized you'd outgrown it? My body did a quick check, like it was opening an old file. Then something surprising happened. Distance. Not denial. Not pretending. Just a quiet, steady clarity that Ethan no longer had keys to my nervous system. Trauma used to run my calendar. It used to decide when I slept, when I ate, how I walked into a room. But it doesn't own me anymore. I took a slow breath, watched Noah smear banana on his chin like it was face paint, and I felt a kind of release I didn't even know I'd been earning. The rest of the day stayed ordinary on purpose. I translated a few pages at the table, while Noah pushed toy cars across my feet. I folded laundry. I texted Elena the simple fact of the alert without spiraling into a story. I noticed the security presence the way I notice seatbelts now there. Quiet, not something I have to worship or resent. Support, not a cage. Later, I took Noah out for a walk. The afternoon sun bounced off the water like little shards of light, and Noah kept pointing at boats as if each one was personally exciting. I focused on normal sounds, strollers on sidewalk cracks, distant traffic, wind moving through the harbor flags. When you've lived through chaos, sometimes you have to practice believing in peace. And then, at 4:05 in the afternoon, I saw Ethan. He wasn't where he should have been in my life. He was just there, across the street near a corner store, lingering like someone waiting for a reaction. He looked older in a way that didn't make me feel sorry for him. He looked diminished. Not harmless, exactly, but smaller than the monster my memory used to inflate him into. He noticed me. I could tell by the way his posture changed, like he wanted to pull the old strings and see if they still worked. What does freedom look like when the person who broke you can't reach you anymore? It looked like me keeping my hands on Noah's stroller and continuing forward. Ethan's mouth moved like he wanted to speak, to throw something sharp into my day, to take a bite out of my calm. I didn't give him my face. I didn't give him my voice. I didn't give him the gift of my nervous system. I kept moving at the same pace, like he was just another stranger who didn't deserve space in my life. In my peripheral vision, I caught the subtle shift of the people behind me: security, staying back, doing their job without turning my walk into a scene. They didn't swarm. They didn't make Noah scared. They simply existed as a quiet boundary Ethan couldn't cross. And for the first time, I didn't feel embarrassed by that. I felt grateful. Because support doesn't erase my strength, it protects the life I fought to build. By the time I got home, my chest felt light in a way I didn't expect. Not because it was easy, not because healing is some straight line, but because I'd proven something to myself in the only way that counts. In the moment I could have collapsed, I didn't. That night we sat on the patio. Me, Dante, and Noah between us with a sippy cup and a toy he insisted on bringing outside. The harbor air smelled like salt and summer. Dante's hand rested near mine. Not demanding, just present. Noah laughed at something invisible and then leaned into my leg like that was his favorite place in the world. And I realized what changed my life wasn't one dramatic rescue. It was 100 small choices. Dignity, honest love, boundaries. I refused to negotiate. Courage I practiced until it became familiar. I'm not the woman from the café booth anymore. I'm the woman who walks past her past and keeps going. If you made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. What moment did you feel Claire became herself again? Drop it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, please like, share, and comment. You never know who needs to hear that healing can be quiet, real, and permanent.